We're talking about a lot of different organs. As you can see, they are all labeled here on this first page, some of which are colored black, some of which are colored red. And that's because there are two groups of organs that make up our digestive system. The gastrointestinal tract, or GI tract for short, and then the accessory digestive organs. The tract, also goes by alimentary canal, is a continuous tube that extends from the mouth of the anus through both the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities. So it includes your mouth, most of the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, and then your large intestine. This overall length of the tract is about 5 to 7 meters, or 16.5 to 23 feet in length in a living person. So very long, obviously much longer than we are. So there's a lot of twisting and turning. Now it's kind of weird that I would say in there that it's in a living person. Your tract actually will grow after you die, and that's because the muscle in the tract relaxes, and that allows it to extend a little bit. But in a healthy living individual, obviously it's not lost that muscle contraction, so it's a little bit shorter. Still very long. The accessory digestive organs include the teeth, the tongue, the salivary glands, the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. We will talk about each of those and their role with digestion in the digestive system. The GI tract will contain food from the time it is eaten until it's digested, absorbed, or eliminated. The muscular contractions in the wall of the tract physically break down the food by churning it and propel the food along the tract from the esophagus to the anus. And these contractions also help to dissolve food by mixing them with fluids secreted into the tract. Enzymes, and we're going to talk a lot about enzymes, are secreted by accessory digestive organs and cells that line the tract, will help break down the food chemically. In fact, that's one of the things that we do and one of the functions of our digestive system that I'll talk about here on this slide. First function, though, is just the act of eating, taking in foods and liquid into the mouth. That process is called ingestion, which is a fairly common term. I'm sure you've heard that word before. Secretion is the release of chemicals into the lumen of the tract from cells within the walls of the tract, as well as accessory digestive organs. And that is a significant amount of stuff, about 7 liters, most of which is water, but also includes acids, buffers, and enzymes. Actually begins sometimes even before we start eating, when we start to produce extra saliva. If we like smell or even think about food, we'll start producing saliva. That's why, like, if you have a dog, like we've got 2, and they are on the floor next to you while you're eating, sometimes you have to clean up their drool spots, okay, because they are smelling and wanting that food just like we do. We obviously don't drool, at least I hope not, when we're that hungry like a dog does. Okay. Number 3, mixing and propulsion, alternating contractions and relaxations of the smooth muscle in the walls of the tract help mix the food and the secretions, as well as act to propel the food toward the anus. This capacity of the GI tract to mix and move material along its length is called motility. And digestion is where we break down food molecules into smaller subunits. For example, we break down proteins into amino acids. 2 forms of digestion exist, chemical and mechanical. Mechanical is a process that we use our teeth for, as well as the smooth muscle in our stomach and small intestine. And the key with this type of digestion is we just take something bigger and break it into something smaller. Okay, so we break food molecules into smaller food molecules. That way, it's easier to chemically digest it. Okay, chemical digestion is much more complicated. It includes or involves enzymes, where we actually perform chemical reactions that we've talked about before, hydrolysis reactions, where we break bonds, which is what we have to do to things like carbohydrates, to our lipids, to our proteins, and even nucleic acids that we've ingested. Okay. And the entire reason that we do any of this is to absorb, which is where we enter or we allow the ingested and secreted fluids, ions, and products of digestion to enter the body, traveling through the wall of the stomach, through the wall of the intestines, and into the bloodstream, or into, in the case of fat, into the lymph, to then circulate to the cells throughout the body. Only the molecules that are absorbed into the body, anything that's still inside the tract is still considered outside the body, which sounds weird, but it is the case that it is. Okay. Wastes, indigestible substances, bacteria, any cells that were sloughed or broken free from the lining of the tract, as well as any digestive materials that weren't absorbed are going to leave the body through the anus in the form of feces. And that process is called defecation. All right, let's talk a little bit more about the tract, learn a little bit about its structural makeup. Talked about this exact same stuff this morning in anatomy, so you guys here getting a little double dose, but that's okay. The wall of our GI tract from the lower part of our esophagus to the anal canal has the same basic 4-layered arrangement of tissues. And these layers are as follows: mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa. And those are all listed from innermost to outermost. So the innermost part of the tract, the inner lining, is the mucosa, outermost is the serosa. Okay. Mucosa is a mucous membrane composed of 3 thin layers. Throughout these 3 thin layers, you'll find plenty of glands, exocrine glands and endocrine glands. The exocrine glands are going to secrete their substances into the lumen of the tract, and those are going to help with digestion. The endocrine glands are going to secrete their products, which would be hormones, into the bloodstream. And those hormones we'll talk about. We haven't talked about those before, but those are some new hormones that we'll learn about. They're going to help regulate various aspects of digestion. Okay. We're also going to find a lot of blood and lymphatic vessels in this mucosa. And that's because these are the routes by which nutrients are going to be absorbed from the tract and into the body. Okay. And this illustration really doesn't do it justice, but this layer is going to have a lot of blood vessels and lymphatic vessels. Surrounding the mucosa is the submucosa, areolar connective tissue, where you're also going to find blood and lymphatic vessels that receive absorbed food molecules. You'll also find a significant number of glands. In fact, we can see some of those labeled here in the illustration. These glands are like the glands in the mucosa, and they connect to the lumen of the tract, in this case the small intestine, by way of ducts that actually go through the mucosa. These glands are regulated by what we call the submucosal plexus, which is a network of neurons associated with the submucosa. Not to be confused with the submucosal plexus is the myenteric plexus. And the myenteric plexus is associated with the muscularis. Now, the muscularis, based on its name, should be pretty common sense, is made up of muscle. But what type and how much is dependent upon where you're at in the tract. In the mouth, the pharynx, and the superior middle parts of the esophagus, we have skeletal muscle. Whereas the rest of the tract, it's all made up of smooth muscle. Okay. And that's important because, as hopefully you guys remember, skeletal muscle, you should remember, is voluntarily controlled, whereas smooth muscle is involuntarily controlled, which helps just allow for everything to happen after we swallow to be done without even our conscious awareness or intent. Now, the amount of smooth muscle is dependent upon where you're at. In most places, it's only 2 sheets, an inner circular layer and an outer longitudinal layer. In the stomach, there's actually a 3rd. But between those layers of the muscularis is where you find the network of neurons known as the myenteric plexus, which is what controls the activity of that muscle. Okay. Finally, the outside, which really physiologically not a whole lot to discuss there, is the serosa, serous membrane, made up of areolar connective tissue and simple squamous epithelium, and overall just helps to connect the organs of the tract to the abdominal pelvic cavity. So not much physiologically to discuss there. Let's talk a little bit more about those plexuses. Okay. If we think back to our very first lecture on the nervous system, we talked about the divisions of the nervous system. We learned that there was a central nervous system, our brain and spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, which is everything else. We learned that there are divisions of the peripheral nervous system. Hopefully you guys remember the terms somatic, autonomic. Okay. The somatic nervous system was associated with voluntary control of our skeletal muscle, whereas the autonomic nervous system was associated with involuntary control of things like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and your glands. Well, in the case of the autonomic nervous system, we learned that there's some subdivisions of that. Sympathetic, parasympathetic, that we've talked a lot about. And then there was a third division. And I told you guys we wouldn't talk much about that for quite a while. We're finally at that point. And that third division is the enteric nervous system, or ENS for short. As previously described, is a division of the nervous system that aids in digestion. Neurons of the ENS include the myenteric plexus, which is that plexus I just pointed out and was talking about, which controls GI tract motility. We learned that word motility just means to be able to contract and move the stuff along the length of the tract. The other component of the ENS is the submucosal plexus, which controls the secretion of the organs. So it controls the release of substances from things like these glands in the submucosa. Now, within these plexuses, there's all three types of neurons: motor neurons, interneurons, and sensory neurons. Okay, the sensory neurons are going to function as chemoreceptors or stretch receptors. Stretch receptors monitor stretch. Chemoreceptors monitor chemicals. We've talked about both of those before. In fact, we just talked about some very similar to that in our last lecture. Well, in the case of the chemoreceptors, they're almost like they're tasting the lumen of our internal organs. In the tract, we're talking about the stomach, the small, and the large intestines. Okay? When we eat or drink something, the pH of our stomach is going to get altered. Like this Dr. Pepper, which is fairly acidic. I don't know what the pH of it is, but drinking that Dr. Pepper into my stomach is going to drop the pH in my stomach. Okay? And these chemoreceptors associated with our stomach, which is not what's shown here, but I'm going to prove the point anyway, those chemoreceptors become activated by that change in pH. Well, not only does the stomach's pH change, but so does its stretch. Especially if we eat a lot of food, what happens to your stomach? It gets bigger, right? Okay. Well, those stretch receptors, or mechanoreceptors, which is their kind of fancier name, they are activated when food distends or stretches the wall. In this case, we're talking about the stomach, but we also have the same situation in our small intestine, which is what you see here, as well as the large intestine. So they're going to send information to the interneurons. Okay. The interneurons are going to interconnect the neurons of both the myenteric and the submucosal plexuses, which is what we see here in purple, connecting submucosal and the myenteric plexuses. Okay. They become activated when those sensory neurons are bringing signals in to those two plexuses. Okay. And as a result of that information, motor neurons become activated, which therefore are going to send signals out either to the muscle, telling it to contract or to relax, or to the glands, telling them to secrete or not to secrete. Okay. And so we see here for the submucosal or the myenteric plexus, the signals going to the muscles, whereas the submucosal plexus, that set of neurons is going to go to the cells that do the secreting. Okay. Although the neurons of the ENS can function independently, they are subject to regulation by neurons of the ANS, autonomic nervous system. And so here we see parasympathetic, sympathetic again. And it's not going to be rocket science here. We know the parasympathetic division produces which response? Rest and digest, right? So the rest and digest parasympathetic division is going to increase the secretion and activity because it stimulates the enteric nervous system. Think of the parasympathetic as it's enhancing the enteric. And as I've told you guys before, when that fight or flight response is active from the sympathetic nervous system, is it important to digest the candy bar that you ate earlier in the day? No. So when the sympathetic nervous system's active, it decreases secretions and activity because it inhibits the enteric nervous system. Now, just like those reflexes that we learned about earlier in the semester, like the stretch reflex when you tap on the patellar tendon, or the flexor withdrawal reflex when you step on a tack. With regards to the enteric nervous system and the gastrointestinal tract, we actually have what we call GI reflex pathways, or GI reflexes. And those are going to regulate the secretion of the glands and the motility, the contraction and movement of stuff in response to stimuli present in the lower tract. The initial components of a typical GI reflex pathway are the sensory receptors, such as the chemoreceptors, mechanoreceptors I just talked about, associated with the sensory neurons of the ENS. These axons, the axons of these neurons can synapse with other neurons in the ENS, the CNS, or the ANS, which inform those regions about the nature of the contents and the degree of distension or stretching of the tract. The neurons of the ENS, the CNS, or the ANS can subsequently activate or inhibit GI glands and some muscle, which alters GI secretion and motility. Now, if this reflex pathway is confined entirely within the GI tract wall, we call it a short reflex. If it's going to involve not only the GI tract wall, but also the CNS and autonomic nerves, and it's also referred to, or then it is referred to as a long reflex. And that's just a really brief discussion on the kind of intertwining of the nervous system and your digestive system. For what we're going to cover the rest of the way, we're going to kind of just move on from that. And at this point, what we're going to do is start at the top where it all begins with the mouth. Eventually, we'll wind up at the other end at the anus, which we won't get that far, obviously, in the next 20 minutes. Other term for your mouth is your oral or buccal cavity, formed by the cheeks, the heart, and the soft palates, as well as your tongue. Associated with our mouth is a lot of stuff. Our teeth, our tongue, hard and soft palate, the uvula that helps us swallow, but also salivary glands. We have salivary glands both on the inside of our mouth as well as around the oral cavity that release together a secretion known as saliva, or what we commonly call spit. Ordinarily, so like not periods where we're eating and drinking, we're secreting just enough to keep our mouth and our pharynx moist and clean. But when food arrives in our mouth, the secretion increases, and this is going to help us lubricate, dissolve, and begin chemical digestion. Secretion of saliva is called salivation. Pretty straightforward as to why we would do that. And it's a parasympathetic nervous system response. Once again, rest and digest. If you remember, we said SLUD. Salivation was the S for the parasympathetic nervous system activities. We classify the salivary glands as accessory organs of digestion because they are not part of the tract. They lie outside the mouth and release their secretions into ducts, emptying into the oral cavity. There are three major pairs of salivary glands: the parotid, the submandibular, and the sublinguals. You also have glands within the tongue called lingual glands that secrete mucus, plus a watery serous fluid that contains an enzyme called lingual lipase. We'll talk about what lingual lipase does here in a second. As far as saliva goes, it's mostly water, almost 99.5%, almost 100% water, but that does leave a little bit of stuff dissolved in it, okay? What is dissolved in it? Those solutes include ions, sodium, potassium, bicarbonate, chloride, and phosphate. Dissolved gases, various organic substances like urea, uric acid, mucus, immunoglobulin or antibody A, lysozyme, which we've talked about before, that lingual lipase that I mentioned, plus another enzyme called salivary amylase. The water in our saliva helps dissolve foods so they can be tasted. We talked about that previously. But that water also helps with the other digestive reactions to begin. Okay. Bicarbonate and phosphate ions in our saliva can help buffer against acidic foods that enter our mouth. So saliva is actually only a little bit acidic, 6.35 to 6.85 on the pH scale. Okay. The mucus that's in our saliva helps lubricate the food so it can be moved around easily in the mouth, formed into a ball, and swallowed. If you've ever done like the saltine challenge where it was like 4 or 5 saltine crackers, try to chew them up and swallow them without, you can't do it. You can also do it like with a teaspoon of cinnamon, I think. Kind of dangerous, but you see people doing that all the time online. What we're going to do in this lecture as we roll through from the mouth to the anus is we're going to keep a running tally on the stuff that helps us digest with regards to chemical digestion. And obviously, though, our mouth does perform mechanical digestion as well. In fact, this is the primary place where we perform mechanical digestion. Remember, mechanical digestion is the process where we physically break down food into smaller pieces. And so in our mouth, thanks to our teeth, we're chewing our food, not like Scooby and Shaggy and swallowing our food whole. We take bites out of it and then grind it up. The fancy term for chewing is mastication. Okay. And as we manipulate that food using our tongue, we grind the food using our teeth, and that helps us mix that food up with saliva, which forms a bolus, which is the term to describe a soft, flexible, easily swallowed mass. Not only do we begin the process of mechanical digestion in the mouth, but we also help to start the act of chemical digestion in the mouth. And this chemical digestion in the mouth comes courtesy of 2 very important enzymes. Okay. And these are going to be our very first of many more to come enzymes. Okay. Salivary amylase, which is going to act on starches, which, if you don't remember, are a type of polysaccharide, or in other words, a carbohydrate. In fact, most of the carbs, hopefully, in our diet are in this category. These will be your complex carbohydrates, not what you get from like candy and cookies and the Dr. Pepper that I have over here. Those are all simple sugars. We have to begin digesting starch because it's a very complex polysaccharide. That's not something that we can absorb. We can only absorb monosaccharides into our bloodstream. So we have to begin breaking polysaccharides and disaccharides down into the monosaccharides. And that'll continue as we roll through the rest of the tract. A key feature of salivary amylase is that it actually doesn't work for a very long period of time. Because, and if you don't remember it, remember that proteins are very sensitive to their environment. Remember how we talked about slinkies? If they lose their shape, they lose their function. That was when we talked about the process of denaturation. Do you guys remember that word, denature? When proteins, like a slinky, lose their shape, they lose their function. Well, the pH in our mouth is around 6.35 to 6.85. That's actually significantly higher than the pH in our stomach, which is going to be somewhere around 1.2 to 3, I believe, if I remember right off the top of my head. Just know that the stomach is a lot more acidic. So the enzyme salivary amylase, which is a protein, is really good in our mouth because it's in the right shape. But when it reaches our stomach and it's exposed to the acid that is produced in our stomach, it loses its shape and then it loses its function, which is the exact opposite of what happens to lingual lipase, which is an enzyme secreted by our lingual glands that helps act on triglycerides, which are dietary fats. Okay. Lingual lipase actually doesn't even become activated until it reaches the acidic environment of the stomach. So salivary amylase is inactivated in the stomach. Lingual lipase becomes activated by the stomach. All right, let's start our list. What we're going to do is we're going to keep a tally on the different enzymes and substances that help us break down our 3 fuel nutrients. If you don't remember our 3 fuel nutrients, those are carbs, fats, and proteins. The first for carbs is salivary amylase. The first fat digesting enzyme is lingual lipase. And we don't have anything to add yet for proteins. We'll finish this list as we go through. From our mouth, the food will move into our pharynx and then into the esophagus. So we'll go ahead and talk about those two together. These don't really do anything for digestion, nor do they do anything for absorption. Their job is just to push the food, what we would call a bolus, because it's not just food, it's now a ball of food and saliva, down towards our stomach. The pharynx is something that is shared between the digestive system. It's shared with the respiratory system. And this is because it's a common tube that when we breathe, air flows through it. And when we swallow, food and liquid passes through it. Okay. There's actually 3 parts to the pharynx. The nasopharynx doesn't have anything to do with the digestive system because we don't breathe, or we don't eat through our nose, or we don't drink through our nose, hopefully. So the nasopharynx only functions in respiration. The oral and the laryngopharynx, though, do function in digestion and respiratory functions. Your pharynx allows swallowed food to pass from the mouth and then through the oro and the laryngopharynx on their way to the esophagus, which then carries it into the stomach. Now, the pharynx is a muscle-bound funnel-shaped tube that uses the contractions of the oro and the laryngopharynx to help push the food forward. Don't think of it as strictly gravity allows the food to just drop from our mouth into our stomach. In fact, you can stand on your head and eat and drink. It's not the most effective way, but it is possible still to get that food and liquid into your stomach. Okay. Now, the esophagus is much longer than the pharynx. It's completely digestive in function. It's about 25 centimeters or 10 inches in length. It lies posterior to your trachea. Its job is to secrete mucus and transports food into the stomach. The mucus that it produces just basically lubricates the food. It does not produce any enzymes or perform any absorption. Okay. Now remember, there are those 4 layers: mucosa, submucosa, and the serosa. I want to just mention the mucosa and the muscularis. The mucosa of the esophagus provides protection against wear and tear. And the muscularis I want to talk about is divided into thirds. The superior third is made up of skeletal muscle, which allows for its contractions to be under voluntary control, which helps with swallowing. The middle third is made up of both skeletal and smooth muscle, and the inferior third is made up only of smooth muscle, which makes its contractions completely involuntary. Now, there are 2 sphincters associated with the esophagus, one at the top and one at the bottom, and they help with controlling the movement of this food into and out of the esophagus. A sphincter is like a circular muscle that is like a valve. Okay? So like we talked about the valves of the heart, they allow blood to go in a forward direction. These guys are hopefully only going to allow food to go in a forward direction. Okay? The upper esophageal sphincter is at the top, regulates the movement of food into the esophagus. The lower esophageal sphincter is what regulates the movement into the stomach. This lower esophageal sphincter also goes by the term cardiac sphincter and is the one that is dysfunctional in people that have GERD. What's GERD stand for? Anybody know? Well, that's what it would commonly call it, acid reflux. GERD actually is short for gastroesophageal reflux disease, much more sophisticated term, where this is a little bit leaky, which enables a little bit of that stomach juice to spill up into the esophagus. And unlike the stomach, the esophagus just doesn't handle that acidic fluid from the stomach, and that's why it burns. And they call that heartburn, right? Okay. And if you don't treat it, it can be very detrimental to the health of your esophagus. It can wear it away because that is an acid that can burn very, very strongly. Okay. Now, when you swallow food, it pushes down into the stomach through the esophagus by a wave-like contraction called peristalsis. Now, peristalsis is one of the two major patterns of GI motility, the other being segmentation. Peristalsis is a progression of coordinated contraction relaxations of the circular and longitudinal layers of the muscularis. And the key here is that it produces a forward movement of matter along the tract, forward only. And that's because the contraction's always behind the food. And it's like squeezing a toothpaste tube from the back end always towards the cap. And this is the major means in which we move food from the mouth down to the anus. Okay. What we can also do, and this is a form of mechanical digestion, is segmentation. Okay. And this is where we're going to do both forward and backward movement through a single segment of the GI tract. In doing so, that helps break down food particles, mix the food and the digestive juices, and bring those digestive substances in contact with the intestinal mucosa to allow for absorption. And this is going to take place in the small intestine in response to distension, and involves contraction of the circular muscle and fibers of the muscularis. If you look hard enough, you can see like this segment is contracted, and then next thing you know, it's relaxed, and then it's contracted again. So they just alternate contraction and relaxation, and in doing so, like you can see, everything's color-coded individually here, but by the end, the greens, the purples, the blues are all mixed in. And that's what segmentation is. With regards to the esophagus, this is not what's taking place. This is what's taking place in the esophagus to allow for us to swallow. Let's talk about swallowing here. Now, swallowing is something that we probably just think of as moving something from our mouth into our throat. Whether that's the Dr. Pepper I just took a swig of, or a sandwich that I had for lunch, or whatever. It's a much more complicated process because it involves the movement of food from our mouth all the way down into our stomach. And it also has a special name, just like chewing did. The fancy term for swallowing is deglutition, facilitated by secretions of saliva and mucus, and involves 3 stages: the oral, the pharyngeal, and the esophageal stages. The oral stage is the only one that's voluntary. And it's where we push that bolus. Once again, the bolus is the flexible mass of food and saliva, and we push that bolus into the oropharynx, into the throat. From there, now that the ball of food, the bolus, is in our pharynx, our throat, we would then be in the pharyngeal stage. It's the first of our 2 involuntary processes. And this process moves that bolus from the pharynx into the esophagus. Now, that bolus is going to stimulate receptors in the oropharynx, which then sends impulses to the deglutition center and the medulla oblongata and lower pons. The returning impulses will cause the soft palate, which is the roof of our mouth, and the uvula, which is the little thing that looks like a punching bag in the roof of our mouth. They move upward, and that closes off the nasopharynx, and we can see that here on the next page. Okay. When we are keeping that food in our mouth, we can still breathe in through our nose. And that's because this airway is open because the uvula, this little doodad, and this, the small intestine, or not small intestine, the soft palate, are not pushed upward like they are here. Okay. Well, the pushing upward of that soft palate and uvula prevents the food and drink from coming upwards into our nasal cavity. We've all like sneezed or coughed while swallowing and had a little liquid come up into our nose before. It's not very pleasant. That doesn't happen very often, thankfully though. Okay. We're also going to have to try not to choke, which means that we need to close off the respiratory tract, which is going to be done by moving downward this structure right here, which is called the epiglottis. Look over here. The epiglottis is this little flap right there that's in the up position, and thus when we breathe in, the air is going to be able to come in to our larynx and then into our trachea, which leads to our lungs. But when we swallow, not only does that nasopharynx get closed off, so does the larynx, and that's because of that epiglottis. That's what prevents us from choking. Okay. The final stage is the esophageal stage. It's another involuntary motion. This is where we pass the food from the esophagus into the stomach. Peristalsis is going to help with this, obviously, pushing that bolus forward due to contraction of circular and longitudinal layers of the muscle. Mucus secreted by esophageal glands lubricates the bolus to reduce friction. The passage of solid or semi-solid food from our mouth takes about 4 to 8 seconds, whereas very soft foods and liquids only take about 1 second. Peristaltic contractions are so strong in the esophagus that you could do a handstand after swallowing food and the food would still reach your stomach. Okay. Or as some college students do, stand or invert themselves above a beer keg and drink, and what they call a cake stand, if you've heard of that, where a person's upside down and drinking beer and still swallowing that food into their stomach. Now keep in mind, during the second and the third phases, can't be breathing because we've closed off the airways. It's not a obviously long-term thing. It's only a couple seconds. So breathing is temporarily interrupted while steps 2 and 3 are taking place. All right, we're going to stop here. This is a perfect spot to stop. We will pick up with the stomach first thing on Thursday. And that's where we really get into the fun of digestion. So I will see you in a few days. Have a great rest of your day.